front and centre throughout December were the bushfires, because we were, going about our daily lives having to wear masks for a very different reason.
Yeah, very true.
Thought repeatership is taking somebody else's idea and just repeating it. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. That's called broadcasting. But thought leadership, on the other hand, is actually all about original thinking. By a long shot, people trust technology more than they trust government or any other actors. What we've learned is that over the course of the last decade, businesses have pursued the efficiency as part of their business model, and that came at the expense of resiliency. But I describe this as the greatest societal amygdala hijack. We have seen 5 years of behavioural change in 6 weeks, and it was imposed on us.
Yeah. This episode is brought to you by Nail It and Scale It, the world's leading fast growth program for businesses. If you have ever wanted to grow your business faster than what you can right now, if you need to make more revenue, if you need more leads, if you need more clients, if you need to know how to plan your business in a strategic way in order to hit big goals, if you need to learn how to scale your business and grow your team and your business so that you have more freedom, then this program is for you. Imagine 3 days immersed with me where we cover all aspects of business, but we do it from an immersive but also an execution standpoint. We execute every step of the way, and we're looking at 5 key areas. We're looking at your psychology, we're looking at your marketing, your sales, your leadership, and we're looking at your planning and how we integrate these 5 key areas to grow your business and your brand quickly. So if you'd like to find out more information, kerwinray.com. So ladies and gentlemen, it's my absolute pleasure to welcome to Unstoppable today. We have Rocky Scopelliti. Rocky, great to have you here.
And great to be here, Kerwin.
Mate, I feel like I do have a little bit of insight on you. You've come and spoke for our K2 Elites before at our masterminds, and so I've seen a bit of your genius. But I always like to ask our guests this question. I know you've done a lot. You're considered to be one of the world's top futurologists, but that kind of is a broad term. So if you're at a dinner party with 6 or 8 people and the room falls silence, and someone turns to you and says, "Oh, Rocky, that's an interesting name. What do you do?" How do you answer that question?
Well, I just come straight out and usually put the label to the side, but I tell them that essentially what I do is I study trends and then predict how they might actually impact the world. And then the follow-on question usually is, well, are you a researcher? And that's when I respond and sort of say, well, actually they describe us as futurologists.
You're
and
right.
So essentially that's what we're passionate about, is the identification of trends and then the research of them, and then predicting how they might impact the world, people, and life as we know it.
So, mate, being a futurologist, I don't remember my school guidance counsellor letting me know that was actually an option. But I did grow up with a mother who was a psychic and a clairvoyant, so I feel like there's a little bit of room for me to play here. It's almost like you're the industrial age psychic. How on earth did you go down the path of being a futurologist in the first place?
Well, for me, it began with a passion, Kerwin, that manifested itself probably about 16 years ago. And I had the benefit of meeting an absolutely wonderful, wonderful human being, an Australian called Dr. Hugh McKay. And Hugh, back then, we were doing a project around some of the early technologies, and I asked him the question of, because we were looking at millennials and technology, and I asked him the question of, well, why don't millennials want to stand in branches, bank branches, for example, when it comes to service? And he replied by saying, actually, I think the more interesting question is, why do older demographics choose to stand in a branch when they have the options of not when it came to digital? And I think that for me was the catalyst in terms of then sort of saying, actually, there's something deeper occurring here at a behavioural level. And unless we actually understand what's going on from a behavioural level and technological level, we'll only ever get a one-dimensional view. And so when you often hear about technology and innovation, it's been spoken about in the absence of behavioural research. And what I realised at the time was that, you know, you had social research going on over here, you had technology research going on over here, as though these things were independent of one another, but in fact they're inextricably linked. And so really that was the beginning of what has become for me a life passion, sparked by one of the most remarkable researchers here in Australia.
And so what were you doing before that? Just out of curiosity, what led you to this?
Yeah, so I've been working in the areas of both science and technology throughout my whole career.
Okay.
And so the I guess the foundations of understanding developments in the technology and sciences were always there, but I had never really thought about the opportunity of applying them in terms of a predictive capacity. And so research was really what brought it together, and this sort of this desire and curiosity, this unquenchable thirst for curiosity that I had, was really what sort of brought those two things together. There were more questions than we had answers for. And
so when you had that fateful conversation with Hugh, was it in that moment you're like, and is Hugh a futurologist as well?
Well, he's a demographic researcher.
Okay.
And it was his passion for social research and behaviour, which for me, I was on the opposite end of that consideration, because I was on the technology side. All of a sudden, there was that penny that, you know, the penny had dropped.
And so how do you go from that fateful conversation to actually commercializing this whole concept of being a futurologist? Was that a bit of a journey for you?
Yeah, look, it really was, because at the time, now, again, coming back, this was 16, 17 years ago.
Yeah.
Technology back then was completely different to what we have today. For example, we were carrying those big mobile Nokia devices or Ericssons, and that all we could do was speak through them, and we started texting through them. We're at the very, very early days of the whole mobile phenomena. Apps weren't even around. And so back then, there were really few people that were what I describe as doing thought leadership. There was a lot of people doing thought repeatership. And there's a big difference between the two. Thought repeatership is taking somebody else's idea and just repeating it. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. That's called broadcasting. But thought leadership, on the other hand, is actually all about original thinking, original ideas. And that is what distinguishes the difference between a futurologist and perhaps a futurist. There are many people who describe themselves as futurists, but I don't see any research. I see them repeating other people's research. And again, there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah,
futurologist.
It's more of a journalistic perspective, though, because it's like reporting. You're reporting on the information that's already out there, whereas in your space as a futurologist, you're actually in the trenches doing the research, looking at the behaviours.
Correct.
And so with that, I'm curious to know, what does the day in the life of a futurologist look like?
Well, it can begin. With I'm up at 4:30 in the morning. I spend an hour going through all of the news wires, looking through what's happened in the Northern Hemisphere whilst we've been resting. And so we're quite privileged in terms of our time zones, because we get the benefit of being able to comment on developments that have occurred in the Northern Hemisphere first in the morning before the Northern Hemisphere catches up the following day. And so I spend about an hour reading all of the news wires, thinking about what's developed, what's unfolded, what twists have changed. Then I might spend some time responding to media inquiries that might come in all over the world. And because we are ahead of the Northern Hemisphere, often we're commenting on developments that have occurred here, particularly around COVID and our response to COVID compared to what's happened in the Northern Hemisphere. So reading, researching what's occurred is profound and to the beginnings of my day. Then it's all about health and welfare. I'll spend the next hour doing meditation, doing some exercise at the gym, or going for a walk. I live on the beach, so I'm blessed to see the world, that way every day. And it reminds me. It's the first sight I see every day. It reminds me about what the world actually is, and how vast the world is, and how abundant it is also. And then I usually, depending on what projects I've got on at the time, in an executive capacity, I run the Centre for the Fourth Industrial Revolution for Optus. And so we do quite a lot of research on a lot of the emerging technologies, such as artificial intelligence, blockchain, robotics. We're looking at all of these emerging technologies and predicting how they might impact enterprises, people, and the like. I also sit on a variety of different boards that include the Australian Payments Council, Community First Credit Union, which is Sydney's largest bank, and also on the Technology Advisory Board for Rest Superannuation, which is one of the largest superannuation funds in the country. And also I do some charity work for a wonderful foundation called Wake by Reach. Wake by Reach is a charity founded out of Victoria about 25 years ago to really help underprivileged children in our society. And my area of demographic passion, I guess, is youth. And so I have the benefit of doing a whole variety of different things, and often I'll be jumping between different projects and initiatives and things that come at you every day. Every day is unpredictable, and it's wonderful to work that way.
And so I dare say you've got your finger on your pulse in a lot of areas, technology, innovation. But I guess I'm curious from your perspective, did you see COVID coming, or a pandemic coming, as a part of the trend research that you were looking at, although there were no trends that would necessarily predict it? But more importantly, what trends did you see developing that have completely shut down as a result of what we're seeing right now? Let's start with the first one. When did COVID first come onto your radar?
Yeah, about Christmas time, because we could see the spread of the disease from Wuhan province across to Europe, and that had principally been occurring through the movement of people. And so it's not hard to then sort of predict that its presence will come onto our shores. But the impact is really what nobody could have ever predicted. And so I knew it was inevitable that it would present itself on our shores. But again, nobody had any idea of its impact. So I'd been watching it pretty closely in Australia.
So Christmas, it came onto your radar. At what point did you go, holy shit, here, there's going to be some serious disruption? Because I know for me, I wasn't as on the pulse as you. I came onto COVID January 7th. It came on my radar. But it was around January 14, 15 that I started going, fuck, this is going to be a big issue. It was January 19, I made my first order for masks for the team, and January 24th, when we did our first biothreat security response plan. Yeah. At what point did you go, okay, this is going to perhaps be a little bit bigger than just, SARS or a flu season?
Well, so over the December to April period for me, I was doing the Australia 2030 research. And the Australia 2030 research is essentially about how do we feel about the decade ahead. And so now you've got to remember, we were coming through the bushfires, the significant impact that the bushfires had on Australian society at the time. And so we're also closing a decade of very turbulent social, political, economic, and technological development. And so it was the appropriate point in time to be asking, okay, if that's how we felt in the last decade, we saw the erosion of trust, we saw our political system essentially disconnect from community sentiment. For example, we had more changes of leadership throughout that decade, throughout those 8 years, than any other nation on earth, despite the fact that most of us saw no reason to change political leadership. We had our parliamentary performance, as my research shows, was well below parliamentary performance in the past decade. We ended the decade economically with a cluster of economic conditions that we had never seen before: interest rates, debt. We saw all of these things, unemployment. All of these things were manifesting themselves throughout the course of the past decade. And so it was a great time to be asking people, given where we've come from, what are we thinking about the decade ahead? And so, again, when I started the research, we were just coming through a point in time where, politically, the Liberal government was experiencing the full brunt of, the Prime Minister not being onshore and being on holidays. We had a Deputy Prime Minister trying to explain bushfires through events such as self-combusting cow manure. There was a discord there with a sentiment of people. And so we had so COVID in December was not front and centre for Australians. Front and centre throughout December were the bushfires, because we were going about our daily lives having to wear masks for a very different reason.
Yeah, very true. Very true.
So I would say it was more that we had prioritised our thinking and where our thoughts were on events that were much closer to home rather than what was going on overseas.
So I'm going to assume the sentiment that you gathered in January, because you did this over a period of 3-4 months, is that right? January, February, March?
Absolutely.
And the sentiment in March would have been very different to the sentiment in February.
Absolutely. And so to the question, so when we look at the question of what do Australians believe will impact Australia and the world over the coming decade the most, it was climate change over the months of January and February. And then in March and April, it swapped completely with low economic growth. So, and that was when, the full, if we look at the month of March, that was in fact, Kerwin, when I was writing the chapter on the economy. And and so I'd sort of had I had my framework set for the chapter, and I was probably about 2,000 words in when the first $17 billion stimulus package dropped. And so I had to tear that up, throw it start again. And so I started again that week. And then, of course, week 2, we then had the state governments coming in with their stimulus packages. Start again. And then, of course, week 3, when we had all of the other keeper programs announced, the $90 billion stimulus announced, again, started again. So I couldn't actually write the economic chapter until the end of March. And so the priorities of Australians have profoundly changed. And I would say,
interesting. Even in March, you were saying in January it was climate change. In March, it was economic. Yeah. Did social did social play any aspect of any of the concerns that you saw people coming through with?
Well, there's an optimism
Yeah.
which I think surfaced, which is
Right.
truly remarkable. Now, what I mean by that is that Australian professionals are so optimistic about the role of technology and science over the coming decade. Now, that was irrespective of whether they responded in January, February, March, or April. There was no difference. And so that level of optimism, I think, is really unique and distinct within the way we think about our future. And so that was a pleasant surprise. And so it wasn't surprising then that when I did questions around the future retrospective, so in 2030, if you were to look back on the decade, would you have reflected upon technology and science as enabling you to fly out of space, to drive autonomously, to solve illnesses that we can't solve today, such as cancer and Alzheimer's disease? We saw that come first and foremost. So the ability for technology and science to solve illness was really the point that Australians reflect back on to say that was truly remarkable. And so I think that's amazing, because that speaks to a non-materialistic view, but a more societal view of the role of technology and science. And I think that's truly remarkable.
Do you think with any of the feedback that you got, especially moving closer to March, that any of it was perhaps governed by a level of naivety around the unknown of what we're getting ourselves into? Because one of the things that I discovered early in the piece, so like January 7, I remember coming across it and I was like, why the fuck is no one talking about this?
Yeah.
And then January 15, why the fuck is, and I kept on saying this all the way through to, beginning of March and beyond. And I was like, why the fuck is no one talking about this? Because everyone's like, oh no, it's not good. It's not real. It's, look, whatever the assignment was, whether it's a global conspiracy or it's a fucking scandemic, there was a lot of apathy, massive levels of apathy, if not borderline progressive ignorance. So, and again, I'm playing a bit of a red team here. Do you think there's perhaps any level of naivety in some of those responses whereby we don't really understand as a country, let alone as a global population, what's actually coming next and what's going to be the fruits of this tree of COVID?
Yeah, so that's a great question, Kerwin, because as I sort of detailed in the chapter on leadership, is I think our skepticism about what we were hearing from our politicians, who were principally the communicators on COVID at the time. I think our lack of trust in in politicians, political system, which had grown to its all-time low over the past decade,
fair call. Wow.
I think played into that. And so what was fascinating was when you look at the question of trust, and you look at the question of who do you trust to look after your best interests over the coming decade, what my research showed that it was in fact academics, researchers, and independent institutions to whom we look for. Government is in fact, and also.
Sorry, was that you cut out then? Government came last?
Came last, yeah.
Wow.
And so I think this is what happened. We came off a very cynical sort of set of perceptions about government and of the built up and accumulated over the past decade, but I think came to a head during the bushfires, where we in fact saw state premiers and also our chief fire officers at a state level rise up to truly remarkable leadership. But we saw the absence of federal political leadership in that experience. And so then when COVID started to then gain momentum and unfold, and where they were the principal commentators on it. That's why we reacted the way that we did. But it wasn't until the scientists started appearing on our news programs and started coming out and talking about this, did we actually start paying attention. And so, when you look at the research around, well, who do you trust to go look for information on COVID? It wasn't governments, right? We were frustrated by the type of information we were receiving. And now this was all around the world, so people were frustrated by the inconsistent information emerging around COVID from governments, from media organisations, and that's why they defaulted to looking to scientists, people to whom we trust for our best interests.
So you've literally written the book Australia 2030. What to expect in the next 10 years. But I'm gonna kind of go beyond the book right now, because you finished writing in March, April. There's been a couple of months that have passed since then. I'm going to assume that you're seeing some social trends that are starting to gain momentum that could possibly stay with us for a very long period of time, that are going to affect everything from the way that we eat food, from the way that we transport, the way that we educate. And to give context, I was recently on holiday in the Hunter Valley. I went to a beautiful restaurant, one of the top restaurants in the Hunter, with my partner and my son and her daughter. And, the long and the short of it is I cracked a very good joke as she was drinking a glass of water. She inhaled the water with such ferocity that she choked, and she had to grab her napkin and, basically pour the water out of her mouth, and she starts having a coughing fit in a crowded restaurant. Now, as any good comedian will, I laughed at my own joke, but more at the response of her. But I laughed so hard that I lost my breath and I started choking and having a coughing fit. And so here we are, the happiest family in this fucking restaurant, possibly the whole Hunter Valley. And then 5 minutes later, the manager comes over. Now, this is a hatted restaurant. And she starts with this beautiful, "Oh, hi, just wanted to come over and introduce myself. I'm the manager." And I'm sitting there going, "Oh, wow, maybe she's a fan. Maybe we're going to get free dessert. Maybe they're going to tell us we're the happiest family in Disneyland." And she goes, "I'm really sorry to have to say this, but we're going to have to ask you to leave." And I was like, "Fucking what? Come again?" And she goes, "I am so sorry." She goes, "In fact, I'm actually really embarrassed. This has never happened in the history of our restaurant, but we're going to have to ask you to leave because we've had a couple of customers become irate at your coughing." And I was just like, hang on a second. I fucking cracked a joke. She choked on her water. I choked on her laughing. And she's just like, "Look, I'm really sorry, but you're going to have to leave. We've already packed up the rest of your meal. You're going to have to go." Now, I was fucking floored. First of all, the restaurant, to their credit, they did come back from this in the following days. But I was floored. I was entertained prolifically. I laughed so hard the whole way home, and I gave my partner all sorts of grief around her vomiting water into her napkin. But I was just like, holy shit. Yes, this is funny. Yes, it's also concerning. But yes, is this the sign of things to come? Now, let me play out the rest of the holiday. We're in another restaurant driving back in Port Stephens. And my son starts we're waiting to be seated. And my son just starts running around the area where we're waiting to be seated. And the waiter comes up and goes, "Excuse me, young man." He's 6. You can't move away from your parents due to the current epidemic and the virus that's going on. You have to stay still and in your chair. And he's like, "Oh," and I'm like, "Dude, it's okay. It's okay. It's all cool." And so we go and we sit down. But then the very next day, we pull over as we're driving along. We pull into this bakery to get some food. And my son, being who he is, he's kind of just messing around, and he accidentally bumps the lady in front of me. And I'm just like, oh, fuck. At this point, I'm on high alert. I'm like, "Mate, just be careful. Remember social distancing." And so then this lady turns around and says to me, "Oh, just bloody relax. He's a kid. They're supposed to flail about." And I'm like, "Oh, for fuck's sake, I can't get this right. I clearly don't have any social fucking coordination with what's going on right now." And I just said, "Look, I hope I didn't offend you, but he got in trouble yesterday from someone for doing the same thing." And she's like, oh, some people are just too sensitive. And I'm like, "Should I bring up a mirror right now?" Like, but again, I'm very much like you. I'm someone who sees patterns. I see behaviors. I see trends, as they emerge and as they gain steam. And I'm like going, holy shit. We have not experienced anywhere near the social implications of what we're dealing with here. So from your perspective, with the breadth and the scope that you have with the finger on the pulse, what do you see as being some of the social implications moving forward? And what do you see being affected? Industries, businesses? Like, where's your thoughts at?
Great question and terrific experiences. And I thought for a moment, Kerwin, you were going to say to the waitress, "Well, can't you ask my wife to leave and I can stay?" I'm glad you did that.
I had another 4 days in the holiday, so
Okay.
and a very high sex drive. So let's not go there.
So I describe this as the greatest societal amygdala hijack. We have seen 5 years of behavioural change in 6 weeks, and it was imposed on us.
Yeah.
And so
But now it's a mind virus.
Well,
and there's one other story now, and now I'll throw one other story in there that I didn't mention. This only happened yesterday. We had a team member in our office, and we've got limited team in office right now, and we're very, we're all above board and by the law. One team member yesterday afternoon started developing a couple of symptoms, left immediately, but the whole office panicked and wanted to go home. And I'm just like, fuck, well, this is going to be a productivity hijack as well. So,
well, will it? Because I think.
Well, this is a good question. This is a good trajectory, I should say.
So what we've learned is that over the course of the last decade, businesses have pursued the efficiency as part of their business model, and that came at the expense of resiliency. And so what happened when all of the raft of changes were imposed on us and on businesses was that's what we found out. How do you put 40,000 people who are centralised in CBD buildings all over Australia have to work from home tomorrow? Where's the equipment? So it came at the expense, I think, of resiliency. Organisations had not pursued resiliency within their organisational models. And so all of a sudden, again, it was just thrust on everyone. So I think what you're going to see coming through this is that organisations have now learned, they've said, hey, from a business continuity perspective, we're good. We pushed thousands of workforces out into alternative ways of working from the home or from wherever. And you know what? Our business continued. Now, some don't. So don't. No,
I get it.
I feel for those, and so organisations are now saying, well, I'm paying $1 million per floor of CBD real estate. Do I really need those 15 floors, in the city when my business can perform as effectively in a flexible working structure? So I think we have now commenced the transformation about the future ways of working. And the future ways of working has been, and I think what we're now learning about is that we can adapt to exponential change. Now, I've been researching exponential change for probably about 7 years now, and that's one of the things that you observed that there were some organisations who are able to adapt as and when these new procedures were imposed by health authorities or by government, state or federal, and others didn't. Why? What's the difference? Well, the difference is that there is resilience and agility in leadership and thinking and operations in those organisations that were able to adapt versus those who didn't or couldn't. And so I think that theme, has now surfaced. I think we can now explain why two like organisations in a similar industry
Yep.
One can adapt and one can't. That
That's a
is,
really good point.
yeah. So I think that's here to stay.
Let's go on the other side of the equation now, because I'm seeing many positives on the business performance side from a productivity perspective, from an efficiency perspective, from a cost saving perspective. I think there's going to be a huge recomposition of commercial property in some way, shape or form. My sense is it's probably going to be dedicated to a low income housing, because we're going to probably see a greater influx of people that are going to be requiring it. But let's go on the other side of the equation, the public facing side of businesses now. What trends do you see happening, from everything from, rock concerts to tourism, or, even just going to the cinema? Like, how do you see, those changes? How do you see, what changes do you see coming in those areas on the social aspects of commerce?
Yeah, so we will see a significant transition into things like, instead of having takeaway food where you have to go and pick it up, Uber Eats, it'll be delivered to you. All of these models that have been there, I think we will see those now come to the surface, because people have now learned, hey, it's a lot more convenient to have it that way. Our behaviour, as I said before, we've had 5 years of behavioural change, imposed on us in 6 weeks. Now, a lot of those behaviours are unlikely to change, because now people have seen the good. They've now seen that, you know what, a digital experience with my bank is pretty good. I don't need to, phone into the contact centre or go stand in a queue. And so I think all of those things will see us exponentially change the digitisation of our lifestyles. Even board meetings over video. In the past, they might have been all face-to-face, where they were, geographically possible. But now boards are realising that, we can run board meetings virtually, securely. And so I think the way we think about life has profoundly changed, where we will see a lot more of our lives become digitised. So that's the first thing. The second thing I would say is, how interested have we now become about our own personal health and hygiene? Yes, there are inconveniences, absolutely, about the masks. And again, I do feel for our Victorian friends, but how health aware are we now? They're now even predicting, for example, that the flu, the impact of the oncoming flu this winter will be less.
Yeah.
Why? We all of a sudden are using all of these things. So I think we have become very, very interested in our health and science.
Because I've got to echo that. I didn't realize that was a benefit, because I'm not a germaphobe, but I just hate it when people come to work when they're fucking sick, especially when they've got some kind of a virus. And now it seems to be everyone's catching up, which what you guess you would say is a level of common knowledge. Yeah. But that kind of begs to ask a different question, which is, well, if we're not being exposed to as many pathogens, is there going to be an effect on our immune system? And are we essentially going to be breeding perhaps weaker immune systems and weaker people, because we're not exposing ourselves to as much virus? We are over indexing on hand sanitizer and soaping our hands and, cleaning spaces.
Yeah. Look, I would say that nanotechnology and biotechnology research and developments are now on those exponential curves. As we saw in the research, Australians feel retrospectively from 2030 that we'll have solved a lot of these illnesses like Parkinson's disease, cancer, all of these kinds of things, which is an optimism about scientific development that we should hold faith in. We have remarkable scientific research institutions here in Australia, the CSIRO, what we're doing at universities. This is really remarkable stuff. And so I would say that as we might be physiologically or biologically exposed to different things through the course of time, we will exponentially be able to solve a lot of those, because the technologies that we are now seeing surface in gene editing, a whole range of these new fourth industrial revolution sciences will be able to solve problems in a profoundly different way. Quantum computing, even, the ability to distill, information, scientific information, will improve the efficiency of scientific research profoundly. And so all these technologies of the fourth industrial revolution will help us solve a lot of the problems that traditional technologies and sciences simply can't today. And we've seen that right with COVID. We've seen how complex the creation of a vaccine is, and the narrative at the moment is now trying to get us to understand that the vaccine may not be the be all and end all. And so a lot of these new, I think, scientific developments are really going to help be driven, I think, by COVID. We will look into the way with which we protect ourselves in a profoundly different way. Supply chains, look at the dependencies that many countries had on China through supply chains. That's been now completely rethought. And so I think all of these things are going to play out when we look at, our place in the world.
It's interesting how this is creating levels of independence on a meta, macro, and micro level. I do pay attention though to what's going on, in the business and the technology space. And I don't know if you caught, there was a live, Mark Zuckerberg did a live, I think it was maybe about 4 or 6 weeks ago, where he was talking about the impacts of working remote, all the surveys, their future plan moving forward. Did you see that by any chance?
Yeah.
It was fucking brilliant. Some really good data came out of there, but I couldn't help miss the obvious drops around Oculus. And it was very, very casually, very charmingly done. But I was just like, after the third drop, I was like, holy shit, he's going to use Facebook as a pioneering business model to introduce VR technology in the office space. That was my prediction, and I'm still solid on that. Because with this obviously remote environment, and we've been doing the surveys as well, the consistent thing that keeps coming back, I feel like I'm missing out on connection. I'm feeling the loss of connection. I'm feeling the loss of, looking at another person beside me. With any of the trends that you're seeing coming through, because it's so funny, because going back even 12, 18 months ago, everyone was saying, yeah, VR's great, yeah, AR's great, but there's not the demand. And so we're not going to see that get really taken up properly for at least another 10 years, maybe more. But I know there was people saying at least it's going to be at least another 5 to 7 years away from it reaching a level of critical mass before it has enough people using it, before it actually becomes a fully functional technology at a global or even a national scale. And then when Mark was going through his research and dropping the Oculus, I was like, oh my fucking God, here we go. We literally are about to walk into the new virtual working environment. And the remote working environment at the moment, yes, we're using Zoom and everything else. But do you see moving forward that we are going to see a relatively fast explosion, or at least some kind of a increase in momentum towards the trajectory of using VR or AR in an office environment? Or
absolutely. So if we just take if we just put take a line in the sand and just sort of say, well, where are we now at when it comes to the desire for physical connection versus having that satisfied in alternative ways? If you look at what's going on with the travel industry, for example, the 7 top airlines in the world now have a market capitalization the same as Zoom, which is a communication platform.
Wow, and that's sobering.
So if you think about, if you start thinking about, well, then if that's been imposed on us, then what's also unfolding? Well, we've got 5th generation mobile networks being rolled out around the world. The world is spending, telecommunications companies around the world are spending 1.5 trillion on deploying 5th generation mobile networks. Now, yes, they are faster mobile, no doubt, but they're 100 times faster than what you're using today. They're down to nanoseconds in terms of latency. There's all of the infrastructure investment for fast, highly immersive interactions is already being laid out. And so here in Australia, for example, the mobile operators are already deploying their fifth generation mobile networks. And so that speed alone is going to improve the quality of vision from where it is today. But I think where you can sort of look at, from virtual reality, I would start thinking about it from a augmented reality. And what does that really mean? Well, augmented reality is principally now introducing other sensory experiences. So let me give you an example of that. Have you been to a 4D cinema at all, Kerwin? Have you been to?
I have. Yes.
How cool is that?
Yes.
Right? And it's
amazing. Yeah.
When the spiders.
You've got the 3D, you've got water being sprayed on you, air being sprayed on you, things crawling up your back. Yeah, it's great.
Exactly. So when all of a sudden touch is introduced, in other words, another sense is introduced into the experience from visual and auditory, all of a sudden it's a completely different experience. And so the ability to emulate the precise sensory experience that you have today in that in that room that you're recording this in my house will occur within the next 10 years. And so when I think the technology can achieve that level of emulation, that is, I think, when we will really sort of see, well, if I can, do I really need to travel to Melbourne if I can have that same experience of sitting in the lounge with my mum, virtually or through a hologram and experience and smell that beautiful home cooking that she makes,
Wow.
because that's what experience is, right? Experience is a singular interaction or a singular sensory. It's invoking all of the senses, and the technologies to achieve that will occur within the decade.
And we are reaching a critical mass with technology, and I think there's check it out on Netflix. Can you just do a Google search for me? I think it's called Uploaded, Paul. There's a great series on Netflix called Uploaded, and it's basically about people when they are in critical condition, should they wish to choose, they can actually upload their consciousness to an environment, which is, in this case, it's like a resort hotel where there's 50,000 different levels. And, every time you want to eat something, you can eat something, you have that experience, but someone in the real world has to pay for it. It's called Upload. It's absolutely brilliant. So before we jump right into the concept, because again, with quantum computing and the speed that we're moving at, and Neuralink and all these other things, it begs to ask two questions. Are we potentially heading to a scenario or a situation? I can't remember what that other movie was, where we literally will be sleeping in a suit with a VR set on, and we don't leave the house, and we become these enormous blimps that just interact through a virtual environment. And does that mean that at some point it's going to lead us to being drawn to be completely digital, where all of a sudden we're going, well, I don't want to have a physical body. I don't want to have a shower anymore. I prefer just to upload my consciousness, and then I never have to shower again. And then I can basically program and create my own world, or I can buy into someone else's pre-programmed world. Now, once upon a time, that would have looked like complete science fiction. But, where we're moving to right now, depending on what information you'd be exposed to, you'd go, fuck, I can actually possibly see that happening.
Yeah.
What's your thoughts?
Yeah. So I think the augmentation of technology in the human has been an area of fascination for us all. And I think science fiction has provoked us to think about those questions. I'm forever.
And I want to throw something out here, because when you think about it, what would be the best way, one of the best ways to solve all the world's problems in terms of disease, war, everything else? Upload them into a matrix whereby they're governed by a series of and that begs the question, are we fucking there already?
Yeah.
Whereby people can interact in an environment where there is there is no mortality, there is nothing but health, and there is nothing but a sea of potential to expand, because we're expanding in a network, not on a planet.
Yeah. So the augmentation of technology and humans has been going on for quite a long time. Remarkably, people who've lost limbs in war zones or through accidents and been able to recover the capacity to walk or to move or to have an organ transplant. So this has been underway. The science of this has been underway for quite some time. But I think where it got a little bit creepy for a lot of people is when you start thinking about it from an intelligence perspective. And, artificial intelligence is the theatre where a lot of these questions, create uncertainty and fear, because the capacity for the human mind or computer technology to match that of the human mind is predicted by wonderful futurists such as Ray Kurzweil. That singularity is predicted to occur in 2029. Now, that's going to happen this decade.
So just for those who don't know, just explain singularity for us just for 1 second, because I think that'll burst a few noodles.
So the test is often referred to as the Turing test, which is where it becomes indistinguishable between a response to a question. It becomes indistinguishable in terms of whether it's a computer or a human. And so that is the point upon which intelligence matches that of a human. And then beyond that is then questions around how you would then think about augmenting your mind. For example, memory. Why do I need to memorize all of this information if my mind is connected to the cloud, where I can just retrieve it, whatever information I need? And so I think once we start getting into that level of thinking about how the mind and technology become augmented, I think that's when it can get really, really exciting. But that'll occur in the next decade, not this coming decade, but the next decade, 2030 and beyond. We'll start to see a lot more of that.
And so would you call this next generation biohacking?
Well, I think that's the other fear that everybody has. And it is a real fear and a real concern. The quantity of data that has been created, and our digital lives were never designed. They just emerged through the course of time. But we've reached a point where we're now actually asking questions about privacy, about identity, about security. We're now asking all of those questions. And one of the things that I encourage people to do is we should be asking questions about gene editing. We should be asking questions about the use of nanotechnology. Now's the time to be asking those questions, not waiting until the end of the decade, because for a lot of these scientific developments, there is no turning back. And it's what I call, making the choice between which road do we want to travel on the next decade. Do we want to go on the road less travelled or on the road most travelled? It's important for us to be asking those questions now and be involved in those questions rather than. And I think again on the back of the last decade, I think we have now reached a point where Australians are much more interested in participating in their healthcare, in politics, in the economy, in technology, in science, more than we've ever done before. Where in the past we might have just bestowed that trust in government, that's gone. I don't believe we will see that. And it's what I refer to as systems leadership, Kerwin. And we're now seeing systems leadership emerge. Look at the remarkable relationship through COVID between federal, state governments and the private sector. It's extraordinary, the level of coordination. That's systems leadership. I think that's the model that's going to define the coming decade. And it will be, nations that have the ability to harness that systems leadership that will, I think, reap a lot of the benefits from a lot of the developments that are occurring and will occur this coming decade. This ability, if you look at Australia and our response to COVID, that was systems leadership at its best. You didn't see that in Brazil. You're certainly not seeing it in the United States, and you're not seeing it in other geographies. And that's why we had that ability to get ahead of the curve. And you'll see systems leadership evident in other nations that also were able to get ahead of the curve. And so I would hate to see us now step back and regress back to leadership of the last decade. Now that we've seen how effective this can be, now's the time to sort of say, well, how do we use this? How do we get government to work with industries in a much more collaborative, transparent manner? How do we now start creating policies that reflect the true sentiment of the electorate rather than the sentiment or the views of factions within a major party? How do we now start working towards growing our way out of the debt that we are now in? Debt in many respects in the last decade, debt was a dirty word. It was seen as the difference between good and bad management. We have to get used to it. Debt, as we have it right now, is going to be with us throughout this next decade, and we need to move beyond that, and we need to be in the mindset of how do we grow our way out of this, which is essentially the message that came out of the Treasurer and the ministers yesterday in their budget update. So that, I think, is what's going to make us different, Kerwin. It is systems leadership. And if we coordinate ourselves in the way that we have, we can address a lot of the issues that occur when moments like COVID surface. And to think that COVID is the end. It's not. It's not.
It's just the beginning. I had the great pleasure of interviewing David Suzuki a few years ago, and he tore fucking shreds off me. It was one of the best interviews I've ever done. I've never been verbally assaulted by a guest before. But by the end of the interview, we had a real camaraderie. We had a real understanding and a very, very strong, I think, mutual respect for one another. But one of the things that he laid on me is he says, unless we can get used to some form of negative growth, economically speaking, the world is headed for destruction in some way, shape, or form, whether it's the destruction of humanity or the environment to the point where humanity is sacrificed and the environment will recover. And so he said, we need to get okay with ideas around negative economics, negative growth. And I remember I'd never even fucking contemplated that before. But I've been thinking about it on the regular ever since that interview. And he said, unless we get used to it, or unless there's some kind of an event that kind of sets us back a few decades, he says, I just don't see any way forward that is going to be, self-sustaining at a climate, global community or a national level. So I guess from your perspective, when we look at the advent of all these technologies, and when we look at the advent, especially of the debt that's being incurred by, governments all over the world, and the trends that you're seeing, do you see us having to accommodate that philosophy that maybe we need to start looking at becoming a lot more self-sustaining, which might produce, in some respects, negative economics, but it'll produce longer-term viability, at a human level?
Yeah, Kerwin, that's a great question. And often when I'm presenting to boards, I ask them about, do you have a 5-year plan and strategic plan? And the answer is yes. Well, how can you predict what's 5 years is going to be like? You can't. That is a very linear view of the world. Next year we're going to grow 2%. And in order for us to grow 2%, we need this much capital, we need this much labour, and on we go. But we don't live in that world anymore. We live in an exponential world where our capacity to predict, 5 years out is ludicrous. 5 years ago, nobody would have predicted the technological advancements and developments that we have today. And so we've got to step back from this notion of being able to have certainty, predicted, and then risk mitigated as we move towards that certainty. That model's done. It's all about regressing now to the theory of evolution, Darwinian theory. Those who adapt will survive, and so the capacity to adapt, I think, is the critical element in our thinking that we've now got to,
whatever that looks like.
Yeah, and again, this there's nothing new about that. It's Darwinian theory, but that is what will define survival, organisational survival in the future. If we look at organisations, back in the 1920s, the Fortune 500 organisations had a average survival life of 65 years. Back 3 years ago, that had declined down to 15 years. I would say by the decade, it's going to be south of 10 years. Yeah. And so what's different? What is different? Why do some organisations survive and others don't? And what my research shows is that organisations who have this capacity to adapt to a ever-changing world around them are the survivors. And it's what I call the constant state of juvenescence, right? Juvenescence defined as the constant state of youthfulness. And those are organisations who have, resiliency throughout the way their organisations work and operate. They're the ones that are, adapting quite well today. Through time, I think, we will see more and more of these organisations change and adapt, I think, to those kinds of models.
It's interesting. I first came across a conspiracy theory, I think, in 2002 and 2003. I think I picked up my first book on conspiracies 2003. It might have been David Icke. It might have been even 2002. And I remember not buying in, but not disbelieving, but just being objectively very curious and going, wow, this is an interesting point of view. And that's one of the things that I appreciate about myself is I can hold multiple points of view in my mind at any one time and not get triggered or have any bias, but just look curiously at each one, based on whatever merits or deficits that it has. But one of the things I have noticed is the increase in what you would call the trend of conspiracy theories as a trend itself, but also the trend of people perhaps buying into conspiracy theories, which, I guess in itself, the word conspiracy is being used, a little bit ad hoc here. Are you seeing an increase in the trend of apparent conspiracies, which is a pretty fucking obvious question, but what do you see the effects of these trends being? Because this isn't going away. And I'm seeing people that were once, very staunch, non-believers of anything other than what the government or the media says now, like, posting things on the scandemic and 5G. And again, I don't know my ass from my elbow, most days ending with Y. But what I do know is there seems to be a lot of misinformation, because people talk about fake news. And I'm like, fake news? What about fake history? What about fake science? What about fake data? There's so much fake shit out there, which echoes the point of trust, especially at the political level. So what do you see happening in the area of conspiracy as a I guess you could say as a subject, and how do you see that implicating us moving forward, when it comes to everything from politics to governance to business?
Yeah, well, so in my research, I asked the question of who do you think you will trust the most over the coming decade, and by a long shot, people trust technology more than they trust government or any other actors. And so I think we that's the direction of where we're heading. But what I would say is that we will trust those independent experts and institutions more so through time than those commentators of their work or interpreters of their work. And if you look at climate change, that's a classic. So if you look at there was a study released only a couple of weeks ago, which showed that Australia internationally was rated A for our response to COVID because we listened to our scientists, and that was the explanation of why we got an A. But yet on climate change, we're rated a D. And so the question here is, well, why didn't we listen to our scientists when it came to climate change? Was it the absence of facts? Well, no. The CSIRO produced a report back in 2009 which predicted the extremity of the events of 2020. And so did Professor Garnett in his report back in 2007. So why in the last decade didn't we listen to our scientists? And I would say now, because of the access to information, whether it's on our devices, whether it's wherever, we can access expertise, independent expertise, at the touch of a few buttons. And so I think that's what we're going to put our faith in. Now,
which is exciting and scary at the same time, because again, who's governing the experts?
It is.
And as we've learned that, a report or research can be generated to prove any point that you want if you've got the right people in your team.
Yeah, and so Edelman has done an amazing longitudinal study now for about 20 years on the question of trust, and they've created this model which is all about the trust inequality gap, and it's a gap between those who believe experts, information, and the like, and those who don't. And the profile of those who do tend to be, professionals from white-collar workers, access to a whole raft of information versus those who don't. And Australia has the largest trust inequality gap compared to other nations that are around the world. And so this concerned me because, again, to your point, who do we believe? What do we believe? And this discord that we have between the informed and the less informed is a real problem.
So does that bear weight? Because now no one trusts the government. So to me, it's like, well, once an institution has lost respect and lost trust, it either has to be rehabilitated, recomposed, or reinvented altogether. Do you see any possibility with a transition in the way that we govern? Because I've often looked at the way that we govern and gone, look, there's plenty of pros, but there's also a lot of cons. And when you look at the trust factor, that speaks volumes, because how do you govern, how does a leader govern a country? How does a leader govern a team if the team doesn't trust them? And we've seen that with what you're saying. So is there a requirement for there to be a reinvention of civilization at a governance level?
Well, what I've predicted is that trust, or the restoration of trust in government, I think is a fanciful pursuit, because I think so I don't think it's a plausible pursuit any longer. I think what we will, and if you look at the proportion of people who have followed the major parties, it's been in decline, for the last 2 decades to its lowest point. And so what I think we will see emerge is much smaller, independent involvement in our political system. We will see diversity, because we will see diversity from parliamentarians who are elected to represent the interests of their community, rather than the interests of a political party, which, as we've seen in the last decade, was not necessarily reflecting the sentiment of the electorate. So, I don't think our democracy as it is, it's far from perfect, but it's better than anything else that we know of at the moment. But so I would think we will see the composition of our parliament profoundly change this decade, and I think we'll see a lot more diversity.
I'd agree with that.
And a lot more independence within our system, because really the last decade was essentially.
So what you're talking about is we're going to see politics being taken out of politics.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
Because
that to me is the root of the issue in politics is exactly that. Like in our organization, we do everything we can to eradicate politics, like everything we possibly can. Yet we are trusting a governance system that is coordinated by it.
Yeah, well, politics is not necessarily a bad thing, I don't think, but it's got to be constructive, and that's what we haven't seen in the last decade.
But it's interesting. No one ever refers to politics as being constructive. When you hear someone, oh, why did you leave there? Oh, I left there because the politics was too great. You never hear go, oh, why did you stay there? Oh, I stayed there because they had great politics. Yeah. And I say that at a commercial level. I'm not talking governance here, but I've heard, I've interviewed thousands of people, and I've heard hundreds of times people saying, well, the reason I left there was because there was real issues with politics.
Yeah.
And it's always referred to. I've never heard politics referred to in a conversation in a term of endearment or in a term of esteemed positioning or practice.
Yeah. So that's about culture, right? So if you look at what's going on at the moment with the millennial workforce, where 1 in 2 of them would prefer to work for themselves rather than work for a organisation. Well, why is that? It's because they don't believe in the hierarchical model. They feel as though they want to make a contribution rather than being told what to do, come to work, Bundy on, Bundy off. They've got their own views about the future. In a world that is awash with capital and has an unquenchable thirst for entrepreneurship, right? They're saying thanks, but no thanks. And so I think, again, all of these things, that's the spirit of independence that's coming through in the choices that we make. And I think what we're going to see is that that's going to be applied to a political environment, because we've become much, much more interested in our policies than ever before.
And I think I said this to you now, because this is the second time we've tried to do this interview. And I'm glad, because this one's fucking better, as I said it would be. But I remember saying to you in that interview, like, I've never had a fucking interest in politics at all until the bushfires. And as soon as the bushfires went down and I saw the massive lack of leadership, I went from not voting and happy to get a fine for it to being a very fucking aggressive, almost active, almost aggressive voter, or interested anyway in the political environment, because I got to the point where, you know what, I've had a fucking enough. Yeah. But I do have one more question, because I am limited for time. I've got to be out of here in about 5. But I look at the current state of economics, and again, I don't feel like anyone has actually felt the brunt of this yet. I think we're currently sitting on a cushion of stimulus, that is going to push us further in debt, that we're probably going to feel for an extended period of time. But at some point, there's got to be a crunch. Yeah, that's my feeling. But at the same time, I've been saying that at some point there's got to be a crunch for the last 8 years, and there still hasn't been a crunch. All economics have defied all economic indicators. But when we look at the situation we're in now, it is economic, but it's a lot of that has been driven by unemployment. We're predicting rates of, I think it's conservative to say 9.75% unemployed. I think that's conservative. If we can manage that, that's great. But what we are seeing now is we are seeing a lot of people being paid a lot of money to do nothing. We are seeing now a lot of people who are being, who have lost their job, lost their employment, lost their business, and they've got to sit there and wait for recomposition, in emerging industries, emerging technologies, emerging businesses, or businesses that will grow further and faster. But the way I look at it now, I've been asking myself this question: how do we get out of this without in some cases, either recompositioning really quickly, or moving to, a model that some people have referred to in the past, where we actually start looking at the prospect of universal income. And I look at, some of the stimulus that's being dropped. I'm like, what's the fucking difference? Where do you see universal? Or first of all, your views on universal income, and do you see universal income actually having the potential to get some kind of airtime, considering the situation we're in at an employment perspective?
Yes, is the answer. Universal income has a role to play, absolutely. And but the secret here for Australia is that we have a remarkable history with the oldest living culture on the planet, and it's entrepreneurship, innovation. Our Indigenous history on innovation is something we should be deeply, deeply proud of. And we have a remarkable history in our modern history of innovation and entrepreneurship. We need to grow our way out of this. And the way we do that is through our remarkable people. And we have this optimism about our future, which I think is really the secret in our culture. And so if you think about it, we've got people who have the capacity to adapt because we've seen it, and we've got this world of emerging opportunities over here. What's getting in the way of between the dog and the post, right? It's all of the systems and things like that. That's why it was so pleasing to see the government put the emphasis on the skills programs. The skills shortages. We talk about unemployment. Well, guess what? We're predicting we need 200,000 technologists over the next 3 years. Where are they? Where's the roles? We're not graduating enough. We've got a skills shortage.
Where's the training? Where's the schooling? Where's the intelligent thinking that goes towards the kids that are now in year 10 as to what they're going to do when they graduate?
Exactly. And so this, I think, is the opportunity before us. We need to take the systems leadership that we have work so successfully for Australia in how we've responded to COVID and commercialise it. How do we now deal? We saw systems leadership be so effective in dealing with the health issues. We've seen it being effective in terms of dealing with the economic issues as they are today. And as we look to our future, we've now got to see that collaboration and that level of coordination, cooperation between private sector, public sector, between government and other institutions. Systems leadership, I believe, if applied effectively, will see Australia recover out of the economic crisis much better than most other nations.
And I think we will. Rocky, I knew this was going to be better the fucking second time around. Whenever I have to do anything twice, it's always fucking better because the universe has my back. But mate, you're an incredible human being. As I said, we've had you speak for our K2 Elites. You've got a book, Australia 2030. It's about to come out. Is that right?
It's out. It's
already out now. It's in bookshelves all over the world. You just can't go to them because you're in Victoria. But they can buy it online. Where's the best place to get it?
Amazon.com.
And have you got any other books? You've written another?
I have. Youthquake.
Youthquake 4.0.
4.0. Exactly.
And where can people find out more about Rocky?
Just find me on LinkedIn. Connect with me. I'm very active.
True professional.
On social
True media. Professional. He's on LinkedIn. Ladies and gentlemen, Rocky Scopelliti, mate, my honor, my pleasure. Thank you so much for being on Unstoppable.
Pleasure. It was great. Thanks, Kerwin.
This episode was brought to you by Nail It and Scale It, the world's leading fast growth program for business. There you have it, guys. Thanks for tuning into Unstoppable with me, your host, Kerwin Ray. And please do not forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel where you get to see all of these interviews in the flesh. Share this podcast with your friends and drop me a review on iTunes. I would love to hear what you guys think and also let you know that your comments help make sure that we keep producing killer content just like this. And if you'd like to stay up to date with all of my movements, upcoming podcasts, events, and much more, please jump onto the website kerwinray.com and also check us out on all social media on the handle @KerwinRay. Thanks for joining us.